Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Asian investors are staying on the sidelines ahead of US inflation data that may influence the Fed's thinking on a possible rate cut next week. Israel steps up its attacks on military sites in Syria, from airfields to weapons and production sites, and sends troops deeper into the country. Plus, in a first for Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu takes the witness stand in a corruption trial where he's been accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersachi, back in Dubai today, so a lot less background noise than we've had the last couple of days at Abu Dhabi Finance Week. Let's get you straight to the markets. A couple of things on the horizon that we're watching out for today. The first is that two-day China Economic Working Conference, and yesterday we sort of got tidbits, we got hints about what they may be looking to announce at this meeting, and certainly that's given a bit of a boost to some of these Asian equities. We'll talk more about that. And then for the US later on in the day, we're going to be watching out for that CPI data. So this is the last significant data print we're going to get before the Fed meeting next week. The markets have pretty much squared on a rate cut next week. It's about 80% priced in. But yet, if we get some sort of a surprise to the upside or the downside, that may reassess people's expectations of the rate cutting cycle in 2025. So important data point to watch out for. Futures aren't doing a whole lot today. We ended yesterday in the red as well, so it's 2 days back-to-back now that Wall Street's slightly weaker, not a lot. We're still close to those all-time record highs. 10-year yields in the U.S. sitting at around 4.24, so slightly higher. We've seen an upward drift of yields in the last couple of sessions. We had a slightly weaker 3-year auction yesterday that's also weighing on the complex. And then the USD, again, not doing a whole lot today, down about 6 basis points, trading sideways. You also want to keep in mind that later on this week, also tomorrow, is it tomorrow? Yeah, Thursday, we have the ECB meeting. So watch out for that as well, with the rate cuts and what they decide to do there, going to have an impact on the USD. Switching over for our terminal chart this morning, and just to show you that typically the CPI print tends to be quite a big market mover. And this is S&P reaction on the days of CPI prints. And recent days and recent prints, actually, for the most part of this year, we've seen upward moves on the S&P 500. It's not much of a surprise given the index is tracking 30% higher on the year, but it does tell you that it is an important data point. But let's go back to some of the big stories driving Asian markets. So much going on there, Avril. Give us an overview of how the handover is today.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. When you look at Asia's stock gauge, it's sitting pretty flat, and the volumes in terms of trading are slightly lower than usual this time in the session. It's the anticipation of the US CPI print, I think, as investors wait out to see whether that data might in any way shape whether we see a cut from the Fed next week. Against that backdrop, we have a softer dollar, and we're seeing some gains in the yuan, Chinese renminbi, as well as the Japanese yen. Some of this is domestic driven, of course. And as you alluded to a short while ago, we have the Chinese Economic Work Conference that's underway this week. So we are seeing a lot of anticipation in markets following the Politburo signals already that there might be more forceful stimulus. That being said, stock market investors have been disappointed before. So Chinese stocks have been fluctuating, struggling to stay in the green. We are seeing South Korea stocks managing to extend gains for another day. And this is a bit of a technical rebound after the losses given the political turmoil in the country. Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much. Now, Israel has stepped up its attacks on military sites in Syria, hitting hundreds of targets from airfields to weapons production sites and sending troops deeper into the country. The Israeli armed forces say some 70 to 80% of the former regime's military capabilities in Syria have now been destroyed. For more on this, Bloomberg senior reporter Sam Daher joins us now. Let's start talking about what Israel has been doing since the fall of the Assad regime. Clearly, the IDF, Israeli government, sense an opportunity to sort of continue with this momentum of weakening some of their quote-unquote enemies who sit on the sidelines. So tell us what's going on there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite dramatic. I mean, this has not happened since the agreement that was in place in 1974. So you can imagine, I mean, this was the armistice that ended the, 1973 war between Syria and Israel and other Arab powers. And this was an agreement that was negotiated by the Americans. So this is really significant, the incursion. And it was condemned by several Arab states as a violation of international law. But Israel has come out and said, no, we are actually very concerned about what has happened in Syria, the swift toppling of Assad, the takeover of the rebels who are, headed by this Islamist group that used to be affiliated with al-Qaeda. So what they hit, I think, are what they consider the places that hold the weapons that pose the greatest risk to Israel. So yes, you mentioned the airfields. So you've got jets that could fly and attack Israel. And also, I was told that one of the most significant sites hit by Israel is directly north of Damascus in an area called al-Qalamun, which is adjacent to Lebanon. And then there you have several bases that actually store scuds. With warheads. We don't know what the warheads hold, but Israel destroyed all of that. Yeah. And they also hit the port in Latakia. I'm being told that there were ships there that Iran loaded with weapons that it wanted to take somewhere.
Yeah. What do you think Israel's endgame is here? Because they say that they've destroyed 70 to 80% of Syria's military capabilities. Does it end there, or are we likely to get another ground incursion similar to what happened in Lebanon?
I think at the moment, again, anything can happen and things can change depending on how the situation evolves on the ground in Syria. Everybody is taking this wait-and-see attitude. It's not only Israel, the U.S., the Europeans, all the other powers, even the Arabs. Yes, they have embassies there. A lot of them have reopened. Saudi Arabia, Egypt is there, the UAE is there. Their representatives met with officials from this transition government that was appointed.
So let's talk about the transition government. Yesterday, we had news that Mohammed al-Bashir is going to lead up the transition government. But the question that people are asking is whether this government can actually corral everyone around it, given all of the different factions and all of the different rebel forces. Is there a sense that this transition government can actually unify the Syrian public now?
I think what they're saying and what people who are supporting this, let's remember, they are on the ground. These rebels are on the ground. They're the ones leading this effort. But there are people also outside supporting this. And what they're saying is the priority now is for law and order to actually make sure the state doesn't fall apart like what happened in Iraq. Remember, the Americans with the might of the U.S. Army, entered into Baghdad. And we all remember those, scenes of looting, of people going into the National Museum and looting it. That has not happened in Syria. So we have to be mindful of that I think their priority right now is to ensure there's law and order. That what they said is, we're going to have this interim, authority headed by al-Bashir until March 1st. So it's relatively short. But what people outside Syria worry about, the sort of the flip side of this is that they are taking control of the existing sort of infrastructure of governance, because you had that sort of, scene yesterday of al-Julani and al-Bashir and an aide to al-Julani sitting there at the Four Seasons in Damascus, with the last prime minister that was appointed by Bashar al-Assad, Mohammed al-Jalali, basically handing them over the keys, basically.
Yeah, the optics, perhaps a little bit interesting. Sam, great perspectives. Thank you so much. That was Bloomberg's senior reporter, Sam Tahir. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has taken the witness stand in a corruption trial in which he's accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. His testimony is scheduled for 3 times a week, 6 hours a day over several weeks, meaning that as Israel takes military action, its leader will be on a witness stand in Tel Aviv. It's the first time in Israel's history a sitting prime minister will defend himself in court. Netanyahu calls the accusations delusional and unfounded. South Korea's President Yoon looks set to fight on set on rather than step down early as investigations deepen into his martial law declaration. According to a local newspaper report, Yoon has rejected the idea of quitting before the end of his term in February or March next year. Korea's opposition is preparing to file another impeachment motion in parliament following Saturday's failed vote. And doctors in Brazil say President Lula da Silva is awake and conscious after emergency brain surgery. Lula will stay in the intensive care unit for 48 hours as a precaution and should return to the capital early next week. The president's health issues come at a delicate political moment with a fiscal plan hanging in the balance. It's also sparked debate about the 79-year-old's fitness for office. And a programming note now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will sit down for an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's David Gura later today on the heels of the latest inflation print from the U.S. and ahead of her departure from the role. Don't miss that conversation on the news of the day and Yellen's insights from being the first woman to head the Treasury Department. And still ahead, we'll get the economic outlook with OCBC Bank as traders await a key inflation print before the Fed's final policy meeting for the year. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Traders are mapping out a game plan ahead of the US CPI print, which may give clues on whether the Fed will cut or hold interest rates next week. Let's bring in Selena Ling, Chief Economist and Head of Global Markets Research and Strategy at OCBC. Good to have you with us. I just wonder if this CPI print comes in line with expectations, whether it actually is going to move the needle at all going into next meeting. The market is pricing in pretty much 86% chance of the Fed cutting. What would need to happen for them to decide not to cut?
Well, as you mentioned, markets have more or less priced in the 25 basis point cut at next week's FOMC meeting. So you really would have to have a big surprise on the inflation front for them to budge from there. I think that said, looking at the recent Fed rhetoric, they seem to have been toning down a little bit in terms of the dovishness going forward. So the game plan really is that, if the headline inflation holds steady or it takes up a little bit higher because of base effects, but the core inflation is still relatively stable. And in fact, we may actually see a mild disinflationary print on the core services side, then that should give the green light for the Fed to actually cut rates. But I think markets really gunning up for a potential pause at the January FOMC. So if we get the dots plot out to suggest that they are backing away from the initial 4 cuts next year kind of story that they indicated in the September dots plot, then I think that would be also another key milestone to watch out for, apart from the inflation number.
Yeah, so all of that is going to come out when they actually come out with a decision in a week's time, especially with the economic projections. The dots tend to be market moving. Why do you think the Fed will revise upwards, if they do, the number of rate cuts that will be priced in for next year?
Well, the big game changer for 2025 really, of course, is, Trump coming back into office on 20th of January and all the threats that he has made on the tariff front and also for immigration, the mass deportations that he says that he wants to do from day one when he takes office. So, of course, this could potentially have an impact on inflation down the road. But it all depends on what is the magnitude of the tariff hikes. It also depends on how fast they are carried out, deportations as well. How is that going to affect the labor market going forward? It will take a little bit of time, I think, to translate into the actual real economic numbers, whether it's on the non-farm side or also on the inflation side. So the Fed may adopt kind of like a wait and see attitude. That could mean that they will not do back-to-back cuts anymore, but they will have pauses in between just to assess the situation. For now, because a lot of things is up in the air, no one is really sure that Trump is going to proceed with 60% tariffs or it's just an opening salvo. So there's a lot of moving parts right here. And I think the Fed is probably going to take a slightly cautious stance, in terms of digesting where the policy shifts are going to be and how that's going to affect their assessment of the U.S. economy.
Let's pivot and talk about China. The Central Economic Work Conference is taking place, and there have been sort of hints about what we can expect to hear out of this conference. And many analysts out there have started revising upwards their forecast for the fiscal deficit out of China next year, some expecting it to go as wide as 4%. What is your expectation of just how much fiscal loosening we're going to get out of China next year?
Well, definitely, financial markets have reacted to the Politburo statements, right? So quite a few key points within the statement itself, although there was no real numbers involved. I think the fact is that they are talking about more aggressive fiscal policy, a moderately loose monetary policy stance. They talked about support and stability for the, property and also the equity market. They talk about, boosting consumption. So that means more demand side type of measures. I think the recognition really is that the environment, the external environment is going to get a lot more challenging because of tariffs out into 2025, and hence domestic policy support really has to step up. So we are looking for, clear indications from the working conference as to what is the magnitude of the monetary and fiscal support that will come on stream. But you are right in the sense that, markets looking for a widening of the fiscal deficit target. I think there is a chance that they may go as wide as 4% of GDP, but we really have to wait for the working conference to announce the details, because the story with China, what has transpired over the course of this year is that a lot of the announcement gets market very excited, and then the enthusiasm kind of dies down a little bit because of the follow through.
Yeah. So the thing about China fiscal stimulus is that also it matters where the fiscal stimulus is directed, because so far most of the stimulus has been directed at the producer side of the economy, infrastructure. Also, there seems to be a push from markets and investors to want to see fiscal stimulus directed more at consumption. How likely is it that the authorities change their focus?
I think the change in terms of the focus has already happened. Part of the reason why the earlier stimulus announcements didn't sustain in terms of momentum, really, as what you said, was that it was directed really more at the producer or the supply side of things. But, the key mention about the property and the equity stability, that I think kind of hints that, they want to stem some of the negative wealth effects that have been taking place. And in terms of the focus on the private consumption part of it, also suggests that they are going to tackle more on the demand side. So we've already seen hints of that. The things about the upgrade in terms of the electrical appliances, encouraging the Chinese consumers to trade in, for greener vehicles, etc. These are demand side measures that are coming through. And I think we'll probably expect that more of these demand measures will come through in the coming year as well.
Yeah, so interesting. Selena, great to have you on, and look forward to chatting to you again. Selena Ling, Chief Economist and Head of Global Markets Research and Strategy at OCBC. Thank you. Well, coming up, Eric Trump says he believes in crypto and thinks traditional banking systems are too slow. Our interview with the Executive Vice President of the Trump Organization is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Eric Trump says he believes in crypto and thinks traditional banking systems are too slow. Bloomberg's Abir Brahman spoke to the Executive Vice President of the Trump Organization on the sidelines of the Bitcoin MENA conference in Abu Dhabi.
I'm at the Bitcoin conference because I believe in cryptocurrencies. I believe that cryptocurrencies are the future. Banking is slow as hell. It's antiquated. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense that banks run on 9-to-5 schedules 5 days a week. When cryptocurrency, you can trade it in the middle of the night on a Saturday at 12 p.m. while having dinner with your wife or sitting on the couch, you can trade cryptocurrency. The banks are lethargic. They don't work for everybody. They leave most people behind. They're expensive. They're lethargic. They're not inclusive at all. And I think the modern banking system is changing very quickly. I think it's one of the reasons you see BlackRock spending billions in cryptocurrencies, and Fidelity and Schwab and just about every bank under the sun. It's the future. I mean, why do I have to go all over Abu Dhabi to try and find an ATM if I want to pull out $100? By the time you pull out the money, you lose 30% on it based on currency exchange rates plus fees for the ATM. When you can literally pop open your wallet, you can send a link, it takes you 2 seconds to do, and you don't have all those problems. You don't have all those structural problems. And so there's no question to me that times 100, right? Blockchain, there's nothing that can be done in banking that can't be done more efficiently using blockchain. And blockchain's changing the world, whether or not people like it or not. And there's a lot of people that see it, the people who are here at this conference. There's a lot of people who don't. The people who don't see it are the people who are going to get left behind. And so I believe in this technology, and my family believes in it. My father wants America to be the crypto capital of the world, and I'm happy to support it today.
Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. President-elect Donald Trump says his administration would help expedite permits, including environmental approvals, for those investing at least $1 billion in the U.S. Trump didn't provide any details about the steps he would take to help investors with fast-tracking projects. The U.S. president-elect, meanwhile, has picked Andrew Ferguson as chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Trump says his candidate has a proven record of standing up to big tech censorship and for freedom of speech. And Bloomberg has learned that President Biden is set to formally block the $14 billion Japanese takeover of U.S. deal. We understand the Committee on Foreign Investment panel, which has been reviewing the deal, will refer its decision to the U.S. president by December the 23rd. A referral suggests at least one member of the panel sees the deal as posing a risk. Bloomberg understands that Klarna has added around 12 banks to the list of firms working on its U.S. IPO. Bank of America, Barclays, Citigroup, and Deutsche Bank have been selected as so-called joint bookrunners on the Swedish digital payment company's listing. Other banks have been tapped for junior roles on the IPO. Hundreds of firefighters are racing to control a fast-moving Southern California wildfire that's threatening the wealthy town of Malibu. The fire has forced the evacuation of thousands of residents. It's now covering more than 2,700 acres, growing rapidly since it began late on Monday, driven by strong, dry winds. And a look at equity futures as we head into that all-important US CPI print. S&P futures leaning towards the green now, up just a marginal amount, up about 5 basis points. At NASDAQ, a similar amount. So not a lot of movement there, but European futures tilted towards the red. We are down about 0.2%. But attention will turn to that CPI figure that's coming out later. Expectations are for a headline print of 2.7%. That's a slight uptick from where we were the last month. 2.6% is where we were. And then on a month-to-month basis, that core figure is expected to stay where it is at 0.3%. Now, coming up, more than a decade of civil war in Syria has left its economy devastated. We speak to Karam Shaar, Director and Political Economist of Karam Shaar Advisory, on the difficult road ahead. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Asian investors staying on the sidelines ahead of U.S. inflation data that may influence the Fed's thinking on a possible rate cut next week. Israel steps up its attacks on military sites in Syria, from airfields to weapons production sites, and sends troops deeper into the country. Plus, race against time. Scientists trying to contain an outbreak of a mysterious flu-like illness, disease X, in the DRC are being hindered by logistical issues. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jemana Versace in Dubai. Another weak session for Wall Street yesterday, though attention is turning to that CPI print later today. The expectation is we will get a slightly, moderately higher print, both on headline and on a month-to-month basis, and core on the month-to-month basis than we got on the last print. So whether or not that moves the needle on rate cut expectations is debatable, given about 80% of a rate cut is priced in. So you'd have to expect a real upward surprise in order for traders to start pricing out the possibility of that rate cut. But it could have significance for the rate path into 2025, hence why the market is paying close attention to this data. S&P and NASDAQ not doing a whole lot today, trading sideways, leaning towards the green. But 10-year yields we have up at 4.24%, so we're gradually moving higher again. We're sort of stuck around that 4.2 mark for a while, but we're a couple of basis points higher going into next week's Fed meeting. And then the USD in focus as well. Today also trading sideways. As we know, the momentum behind the greenback has largely been quite constructive. It's been a bullish run for the USD into and out of the US elections. One driver to watch out for is that ECB meeting coming out tomorrow. The language there, if they sound very dovish, that could give another leg up to the USD. And then not shown here, but also oil is in focus today as well. We're seeing a bit of a jump this morning. Again, equally, as we talk about yields sort of stabilizing around 4.2%, what we've seen is oil has been trading in a very tight range, too, of around $72 to $74. Today, we are seeing a bit of support come through, maybe on back of geopolitical risk, but also bear in mind that OPEC will be releasing their monthly outlook report later today as well. Switching over to another chart on our radar this morning, and this just tells you what's been happening to the gold complex, because year-to-date, gold is up 30%. And we were reporting just a couple of days ago that we did see a bit of, again, supports come through to gold because China have announced, the PBOC announced last month that they did start buying gold again. This is the first time that they've been buying gold since April of this year. There was a bit of a pause in the summer, but notable given how much gold has climbed throughout the course of this year. All right, let's also check in on how China assets are doing with a key economic work conference underway. Avril Hung is in our Singapore studio.
Yeah, Jumana, the focus is really on what we ultimately get from this economic work conference, which is supposed to kind of set the policy after the Politburo, the top leadership in the country, set the tone. And indeed, it sent really forceful stimulus signals. But in stock markets, this is an area that, investors have been disappointed before. So Chinese stocks today are fluctuating. They're not really managing to stay in the green. Where we are seeing gains are in Chinese bonds. A day ago, we actually saw them on the 10-year climbing by the most in about 4 years. This chart, courtesy of MLife's Mark Cranfield, brings you a bit more perspective. And, he makes the point that the assessment that long-term yields will decline, that seems reasonable. But if you look at what we're seeing shorter term and how China bond futures have climbed, there's really sharp move here. And this is perhaps a sense that in the near term, what we might actually see if there's policy disappointment especially is a sense of buy the rumor, sell the fact. And that, sets things up for a negative reaction. So keep in mind this as we keep an eye on Chinese assets. Jumana.
Yeah, very good point. Avril Hung in Singapore there. Well, the rapid fall of Syria's Bashar al-Assad has put focus on Syria's ailing economy. Years of civil war have left it crumbling, with its GDP falling almost 90% in a decade after the conflict started. Its oil production was largely based in rebel-held areas, so Assad could no longer look to that industry to shore up his budget. Syria has also become a major producer and trafficker of narcotics, which Assad blamed on Western and regional states, causing what he described as chaos. Let's bring in now Karam Shaar, Director and Political Economist of Karam Shaar Advisory. Sir, it's great to have you with us on the show today. Before we talk about the economic trajectory of Syria, I just want to ask you, as a Syrian, I read a bit about your bio. You were involved in the civil uprising against the Assad regime in 2011. You later left the country. You had to flee your home. Your home got destroyed. Here you are, many years later, the Assad regime has finally fallen. How do you feel?
It's been 13 years since we took to the streets demanding the downfall of the Assad regime. I do feel elated. I'm glad for many of us Syrians. I think over 70% of the population have actually known nothing during their lifetimes but the Assads. The Assads have been ruling the country for 54 years. So I'm very happy to see them gone, especially as the world is now seeing the massacres that they have done. Now that they're away, the prisons are opening up. People are starting to tell their stories of torture. The number of the disappeared is starting to emerge, which seems to be around 100,000. So I think I'm generally happy, but I'm also growing increasingly anxious of what is to come.
Yeah. So yesterday we got reports that Mohamed al-Bashir is going to lead up the transition government, of course. What hope do you have that this is going to be the right government or right set of people to start the rebuilding process in Syria?
I think we're nowhere near talking about reconstruction, rebuilding the economy, because actually the government that is now in charge, and its Prime Minister, who's a member of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are actually designated terrorist organizations. Now, they have, and these are actually UN-wide sanctions, which are more stringent than the sanctions on the Assad regime, which were unilateral. So I think there's so much uncertainty as to whether these sanctions will be lifted to begin with, and this will all be contingent on how the new government will conduct itself. Now, they've so far been sending very positive signs that they're going to be inclusive. The fact that they managed to to control regime-held areas without much blood is a very good sign, but I think the history of the group is still very problematic, and many countries would not want to engage with Syria yet unless the government shows more signs of being inclusive. Al-Bashir is basically the head of the Salvation Government. The Salvation Government is the administrative body of Tahrir al-Sham, which has been running the enclave in northwest Syria. So I think they have done quite well in terms of governance, but in terms of freedoms like human rights and so on, their record is mixed.
Yeah. Again, turning back to the process of rebuilding Syria from here, many people around the world are now taking a look at what's happened to the Syrian economy over the course of this civil war. I was reading that 90% of the population live in a state of poverty. This is per the UN. But then also, Syria has also become somewhat, for all intents and purposes, a narco state. And you have written a lot about the passageway of this so-called captagon. It is a narcotics drug that has been shuffled through Syria for many years now, has supported the Assad regime. What can be done to clean up the place, so to speak, and to stop the drug trafficking that is taking place?
I mean, first, I think we need to highlight that was an industry that was sponsored by the Syrian government. So it's not like they were some of the actors in that industry. No, they were critical. You know, Bashar al-Assad, his immediate cousins were actually sanctioned for their role in Captagon. And actually, after the opposition took control of regime-held areas, the evidence is starting to emerge. Yesterday, we saw that in Al-Mazze military airport, there was Captagon. So they were using a military facility, actually, for producing and smuggling Captagon. Now, the outlook ahead, I think we need to appreciate that the position of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has always been against narcotics, and they managed to actually obliterate any type of drug-like production or activity in the areas that they controlled in northwest Syria, and I suspect this will continue. However, it's not going to be immediate. It takes a lot of time to dismantle these networks, but what I think consumer markets need to worry about, which happen to be mostly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Iraq, and so on, is basically production moving into other places. And we've been seeing this over the past year. Because of the high profit margins, many makeshift facilities have started to sprout in the region, in Iraq, in Egypt. I think the key issue there, or the key question, is whether these facilities would be able to produce Captagon on an industrial scale that the Assad regime used to produce. I think it's not possible because you need political sponsorship to be able to produce the mind-numbing numbers that we were seeing before. I mean, the amount seized, the amount of Captagon seized, like last year, it's 300 million pills. You know, that's the amount seized, let alone the amount consumed.
Wow, that is an astonishing number, but also speaks to just how many players were involved in the support of this illegal drug industry. How important is it, do you think, that in this next phase that we talk about, with the transition government, with hopefully the process of rebuilding, that the international community are involved not in a military capacity, but actually in a reconstruction capacity?
I think the international community will need to give the initial push for the Syrian economy, you know, to lubricate that machine that hasn't been working for a long time. Or operating at a minimum capacity. Now, I think the engagement of the international community needs to be based on a step-for-step approach, or I know this term has negative connotations for many Syrians because that's how the UN has been approaching it. But I think there needs to be gradual lifting of all sanctions on Syria, but conditional on progress that the Salvation Government or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its head Ahmed al-Shara, that they show progress towards inclusivity, towards democratic governance. And in fact, I mean, there is a framework for all of this to happen, which is UN Security Resolution 2254, which calls for a transitional government, calls for a new constitution, and then followed by democratic elections. Now, the economy, I think, it's in tatters. It needs help initially, I think, with funds that the state needs to lead on, you know, so it needs to be state-led, that reconstruction. But I can tell you a bit more about each sector and so on, but
Yeah, well, we'll save that for another time. Karam, it's been really great talking to you. Karam Shaar, Director and Political Economist of Karam Shaar Advisory, and also a voice from Syria. Well, coming up, scientists are racing against time to contain an outbreak of a mysterious flu-like illness in the DRC. We'll bring you the latest on the so-called Disease X next. This is Bloomberg. Scientists are racing to contain an outbreak of a mysterious flu-like illness in a remote part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. More than 400 cases of the unidentified disease X have been reported since late October, with most amongst children under 5. My co-host Jennifer Zabazaja joins us now with more from Johannesburg. It's still called a mystery disease. It's disease X. We're still waiting for a name. But what do we know about what is happening with the disease and just how virulent it is?
Right, and Jumana, that is significant because we are still waiting to get a few more details about this pathogen, which is why the WHO proceeds with this naming Disease X, but potentially we could get a naming in the next few days. Listen, the details at this point, it seems like the WHO is listing acute pneumonia, influenza, COVID-19, measles, and malaria potentially as causal factors to it. And what we're hearing is that people who do get infected, and you were mentioning this, a lot of times we have seen children be affected by it, but they're also getting fevers, headaches, coughs, runny noses. But there are still some questions, though, about whether or not we're seeing just one disease or potentially a confluence of different diseases that people are being affected by. And what's actually been very interesting is a lot of the cases have been cases of people who have been malnourished. And so that is a part of this factor that a lot of scientists and experts are trying to piece together. And really the significance here is that, yes, we do know that this is concentrated in a very remote part of the Congo. It's about 48 hours drive away from Kinshasa, which is the capital. That is significant because it's been difficult to test. It's been difficult to really get experts over to the ground there. But at this point in time, it seems like experts are really mobilizing, trying to get to this before this potentially becomes a wider issue that could potentially spread. But we should note at this point in time, it is concentrated to this area.
Yeah, you say it's concentrated to a certain area, but how concerned are authorities in general and the risk of it spreading to other areas?
Right. And what has been interesting is the remoteness of this really being a focus, I think, because that does affect the testing and the capabilities to get to the lab. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this is not a global issue or an issue of global health concerns. And so we have seen the WHO, we've seen the Africa CDC, national, international experts really coming together and trying to figure out what is happening with this specific disease. And it appears that many people who do actually contract it do get severely sick. And so whether or not it is airborne or not, the airborne element of it is still of question. But it seems like authorities are trying to at least track down what is happening in this region before it could potentially move out elsewhere, just to get a few details on that front. Jumana.
Jennifer, thank you very much. Well, on to Mauritius now. The country has cut its economic growth forecasts and expects a bigger hole in its finances after an audit found miscalculations in the prior government's budget. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Indira Ganga. So this is an interesting situation. What exactly went down with that prior budget, and how did these discrepancies come to light?
Hi, Jumana. So the current administration is saying that they're finding that the economy is far more worse than they expected it to be. When the new administration came into power, they ordered an audit of the Ministry of Finance. And what they're saying is they have uncovered mismanagement of the economy and falsifying of data. There has been a lot of inflation of data in the country. If you look at GDP, the numbers reflected in the local currency does not reflect in dollar terms. If you also look at private sector growth, it's been very dismal. Investors are very hesitant to put their money into the economy because they're uncertain of the policy environment. And this has led to money only flowing into one sector, which is real estate. So if we look at those numbers, you find that you look at something like the fiscal deficit, it's double what had been reported at 48.5 billion rupees. You also look at borrowing. They'll need to borrow an extra $59.6 billion. And this raises public debt to about 83.4%, which is such a huge number. And this is some of the factors that have led them to revising down their GDP projections to about 5.1%. Inflation is also a big issue. It peaked at 12%. It's down to 3.4%. But if you look at this report, the cost of certain goods, particularly food items, are still above 100% what they were a couple of years ago. So the government is saying they will need more time to clear this mess. It's a difficult task, but it's doable and it will take time.
And Indira, sticking to Mauritius, a review announced on a strategically important US-UK military base. Tell us more.
Well, the new administration has also asked for a review of this deal that Mauritius had signed with the US and the UK. And the UK is downplaying this review, saying it's just standard operating procedure when a new administration comes into power. And they're laying fear of this deal falling apart. Now, this deal was signed between the UK, the US, and Mauritius. And with President Donald Trump coming into power, his position is uncertain. Though Marco Rubio, who is his Secretary of State pick, says it poses serious threat to the national security of the U.S. So they're probably likely to want to review this deal from their end too. But if it goes through, Mauritius is set to gain billions of dollars in compensation, as the UK agreed to cede the sovereignty of Chagos Archipelago, and they will maintain Diego Garcia, where the military bases are situated.
Indira Ganga in Kigali, thank you so much for the reporting. Well, coming up, a tepid performance. Food delivery firm Talabat's debut disappoints. We discuss expectation versus reality next. This is Bloomberg. Now let's turn to a local listing. Talabat debuting in Dubai yesterday after its much-hyped $2 billion IPO. But shares closed down at 6.8% following an initial pop of more than 7%. The weak performance adding to a string of disappointing debuts for the Middle East. Our Mideast Money reporter Laura Gardner-Cuesta joins us now. What happened? We were talking about the great book building that was going on for Talabat. Why did it drop so much yesterday?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like you said, it's coming after a string of weak openings in large deals in the Middle East. It did initially pop, like you said, and then it went down. So I think one of the reasons could be a bit of investor fatigue, a bit of profit taken before year end. People just don't want to risk it. So that could be one of the reasons. There was also news that Meituan, a Chinese competitor, was planning to enter into the UAE. This happened after the deal price, so that could be a reason that gave people some caution.
Yeah, that is a big issue because obviously in Saudi Arabia they have a huge share of the market. I believe I read somewhere that they're actually the #1 player in Saudi Arabia. So the competition is going to be good for Talabat.
Exactly. So it could be that. But yeah, sorry.
So one of the conversations that I was actually having on the sidelines of Abu Dhabi Finance Week with some of these, very international senior executive flying over was that it is important when local companies price these deals and come to market that the investors that they're placing the shares with are long-term investors, not hedge funds who may be coming in to take in a speculative position or retail money who may be in it for a short-term horizon. So what do we know about how these books are being allocated?
So I think Talabat definitely saw more international investors than other more local deals. I mean, its shareholder delivery hero is a German company, so there was definitely more international investment. We don't know the details of the book, but like you said, it's possible that there were more hedge funds or tech investors. And like I said, given how close we are to year end, it's simply not a risk that they might want to take.
Well, let's see how the stock performs in coming days. As you say, it could just be bad timing with the announcements of Meituan, but certainly we have Talabat, we had Lulu, and we had Spinneys all happen in the last year.
Yeah.
So the retail sector is picking up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Laura, thank you very much. Laura Gardner-Cuesta, our Mideast Money reporter. And a quick look at futures as we head to the break. Not a lot going on here. S&P futures, NASDAQ are leaning towards the green but flattish. Eurostoxx futures down 0.2%. That is it for the first hour of Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai. Stay with us for the second hour as Jennifer Zabazaja joins me from Johannesburg. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Asian investors staying on the sidelines ahead of U.S. inflation data that may influence the Fed's thinking on a possible rate cut next week. Israel steps up its attacks on military sites in Syria, from airfields to weapons production sites, and sends troops deeper into the country. Plus, in a first for Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu takes the witness stand in a corruption trial where he's accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Good morning again, everybody. It's just gone 9 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai.
And I'm Jennifer Zabazaja in Johannesburg, where it has just gone 7 a.m. Welcome to the second hour of Horizons Middle East and Africa. Jumana, nice to see you back in the studio.
Yes, it's good to be back here, Jen, and slightly less noisy than where we were yesterday. But let's talk about markets, because the focus for investors is going to be on that CPI print coming up later today. In the U.S., we may see a slight uptick to the headline figure on an annual basis, and that won't necessarily come as a surprise to the markets and might not move the needle on what the investor community are pricing in terms of the Fed cutting cycle next week. But again, going into next year, the inflation data could be actually key to determining what the Fed do, especially if we have a major upside surprise as we get into that Fed meeting next week. But S&P and NASDAQ not doing a whole lot today. We are marginally in the green, up about 5-10 basis points here. 10-year yields at 4.24%, so a couple of basis points higher over the course of this week. Yesterday, we had somewhat of a weakish 3-year auction. And then the USD, again, slipping a little bit today, so trading sideways. But we have been talking about the upward momentum to the USD into and out of those U.S. elections. Switching over This is the picture for the S&P on CPI days, and you can see that it tends to move the markets quite substantially. The biggest time it moved was, you have to go all the way back to 2022, when we had a bit of a downward surprise there in the inflation figures that led the market to price in further rate cuts. But over the course of this year, as you can see, most of the bars are green, suggesting that irrespective of the CPI data that comes through, the S&P tends to climb, which is no surprise. The index is up 30% this year. Okay, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio. And of course, the attention is on this working conference, the economic conference taking place in China.
Yeah, attention on that, attention on the US CPI as well. And ahead of all this, we're seeing Asia's stock gauge retreating. China's back from the lunch break, and we're seeing how it's really been struggling to clock gains as investors wait for concrete details on stimulus with that economic work conference underway. I also wanted to highlight what we're seeing in South Korea. Stocks there extending gains from yesterday, and we know how lawmakers are still seeking the impeachment of the president. BNP is of the view that if the bill passes this weekend, that could help South Korean stocks to stabilize. Meantime, on the sectors that we are keeping a close watch on, tech is the drag on the stock benchmark in the region today. TSMC is declining for another session as the sector increasingly is drawn into the competition between the US and China. Jumana.
Avril, thank you very much. Avril Hong in Singapore. Israel has stepped up its military attacks on military sites in Syria, hitting hundreds of targets from airfields to weapons production sites and sending troops deeper into the country. The Israeli armed forces say some 70 to 80% of the former regime's military capabilities in Syria have now been destroyed. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned Israel will react forcefully if the new regime in Syria allows Iran to re-establish itself in the country or permits the transfer of weapons to Hezbollah. For more on this, Bloomberg's Patrick Sykes joins us now. Patrick, you've been covering the region for a very long time with a particular focus on Iran, and I thought it was interesting that the leader of HTS a couple of days ago said in his speech when they were announcing this transition government that he would like to see the shadow of Iran reduced in Syria. He said for so long Syria has been the battleground of other states, specifically referring to Iran. Does that give us an inclination for how this transition government may be approaching the relationship with Iran?
Hi there. Yeah, I think that, and also the Israeli strikes that you mentioned, they just show in the extent to which all the actors involved here, they're trying to shape this still very embryonic new incoming administration as far as possible in their own image, right? So for the US, for the G7 and Europe, that means encouraging a kind of administration that protects minority rights and respects the rule of law. For Israel, its priority is obviously to not allow any kind of repeat of the Iranian presence that marked Syria for all of those decades. So I think it just goes to show the extent to which everyone's trying to influence what's still a yet to exist administration that could go in still many different directions.
And we've spoken about this in the past. The president has been presented as somewhat of a more moderate face of the regime versus some of the IRGC commanders or the Ayatollah. What is the likelihood, do you think, of Pezeshkian wanting to use perhaps this opportunity to re-engage with the West and maybe talk about reviving that 2015 nuclear deal, given that they're not coming from a position of strength right now?
That's right. I mean, insofar as foreign policy as defined by the so-called axis of resistance that Iran has pursued for so long is now obviously severely diminished, perhaps to an extent that strengthens Pezeshkian's hand in terms of, adopting a strategy that's more about outreach. I think after the pressure that began with the war in Gaza, to an extent, Iran doesn't have much of a choice in that matter anymore. The axis is obviously severely diminished. I think it's also worth mentioning there is still some people left standing in that, right? Yemen, the Houthis there being, I think, the final example. Syria has fallen, Hezbollah severely weakened, Hamas obviously close to wipeout, it seems. But in Yemen, the Houthis are still there. They're still attacking ships. So it'll be interesting to see how that part of the resistance, to an extent, the last functioning part of it, evolves over the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, certainly a lot of challenges, both economically and politically there. Bloomberg, Patrick Sykes, thank you so much.
All right. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has taken the witness stand for the first time in his corruption trial. He's accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a case that has deeply divided the nation. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Galit Altstein, who's joining us now from Tel Aviv. So, Galit, we mentioned this is dividing the nation quite a bit, but it's also a case that's going to see Netanyahu testifying at least 3 times a week, 6 hours a day, and we've already heard a bit from him. Talk to us about some of his initial remarks that he gave us.
Yes, so Netanyahu took the stand yesterday, the witness stand, for the first time in his own corruption trial. This is a first in Israel's history. He is, as you mentioned, accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 different cases. In essence, what he's accused of is having sought favorable media coverage from 2 different Israeli media outlets, in turn for giving them more better regulation and legislation that would line up with their business interests of the publishers of these media outlets. So that's one thing. And in another case, he's accused of having illegally accepted gifts like cigars and cases of pink champagne from Hollywood producer Arnold Milchan and Australian businessman James Packer. In turn, he had tried to help Milchan with the U.S. authorities on his entry visa and his staying permits in the U.S. and also with some tax regulation here in Israel. So Netanyahu has pushed back against all these charges. He was indicted 5 years ago. So apart from the comments yesterday in court, we've heard him comment about these allegations in the past. He says none of it is true. He says that the gifts were all among friends. And he says that seeking favorable media coverage is, normal manner for any politician, especially for any prime minister.
And Galit, when we think about the significance of the timing of this, also the fact that this is a case that's been going on for quite some time, what does this do to the political situation in Israel right now, and to potentially the strength that Netanyahu has tried to at least exude?
Yeah, so there's several things worth mentioning. I think the first would be, and you also mentioned this, that Netanyahu is now expected to testify 3 days a week for 6 hours each time. So that's roughly 18 hours a week. That is quite a long time, and that has steered an argument in itself on whether Netanyahu can still sit as prime minister and run the war that Israel is involved in. Israel is still fighting in Gaza. It is involved in a ceasefire in Lebanon, and it is also involved in, as we just heard, in massive attacks in Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. So there was a question of whether he can keep doing all that as he testifies for 3 days a week. Netanyahu himself tried to approach the court and narrow down the days of his testimony. He asked to testify just 2 days a week or for fewer hours. That was rejected by the judges in this case. At the same time, a petition was submitted to the Supreme Court asking that Netanyahu be declared temporarily incompetent to serve as prime minister for the duration of his testimony, and that too was rejected by the Supreme Court. So now we're seeing a situation in which he will testify as planned 3 days a week and keep running all of Israel's affairs. We got a little bit taste of what that would look like yesterday. He did ask for a few recesses, and he did get some notes as he was sitting on the stand, which is quite uncommon for someone who is testifying in court. But he did manage to see through the 6 hours, and we have to see how that will play out moving forward. And one more point that is very much worth mentioning is that in the 8 years since the investigations against Netanyahu were made public, and in the 5 years since he was indicted, he has been constantly attacking law enforcement agencies, police, the courts, and saying that they were driven by a plot to take down his government. That has led to a big divide in Israel, to big protests just before the war. And these protests and this divide are deemed to have played a large part in Hamas' decision to carry out the October 7th attack, as Israel was likely perceived weak.
Bloomberg's Galit Altstein, thank you so much for your reporting as you continue to follow that trial. And turning now on a programming note, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will sit down for an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's David Gura later today on the heels of the latest inflation print from the U.S. and ahead of her departure from the role. Don't miss that conversation on the news of the day and Yellen's insights from being the first woman to head the Treasury Department. Now, still ahead, we have more news. We'll get the market outlook with Neovision Wealth Management as traders await a key inflation print before the Fed's final policy meeting for the year. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai. Traders are mapping out a game plan ahead of the US CPI print, which may give clues on whether the Fed will cut or hold interest rates next week. Joining us now is Ryan Lemand, co-founder and CEO of Neovision Wealth Management. I was just looking at what is priced in for next week. It's pretty much a done deal, 80% priced in that they're going to cut interest rates. So I guess today matters not necessarily for what happens next week, but what might happen in 2025.
Absolutely. Good morning, Jumana. So we think that the Fed will cut rates more than the markets are expecting or pricing
next year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So 25 is a given, and next year probably more cuts, because until today, the synchronization between monetary policy and fiscal policy has been fantastic. So fiscal has been very expansionary without causing inflation, simply because the Fed has taken rates to a very good, decent level. Next year, we expect fiscal contraction thanks to the Doge that Elon Musk will be handling. And at the same time, the Fed will need to cut rates sufficiently to match that drop in fiscal policy. The only outlier here is the tariffs that President Trump will be imposing, which we think over the longer term will be inflationary. So the question is the second half of 2020.
Okay, it's interesting that you think the Fed are going to be cutting because of the fiscal angle. Of course, they would never say that because their mandate is they've got a dual mandate. Let me just ask you about the labor mandate, because we had NFP prints come through on Friday. Again, an upward surprise. And if you look at the state of the U.S. labor market, it's actually pretty healthy. You're still looking at job creation of north of 170,000 jobs being created every month. Can that momentum continue next year?
No. And simply because of that fiscal contraction, and this was mentioned by Elon Musk with the Doge. So if you look at the breakdown of the job creation, it's a large chunk are civil servants, education, social services, etc. So these are expected to drop next year if there is a fiscal contraction. The fiscal contraction is between 150 billion and 200 billion. This sounds not too much out of the 6.7 trillion. However, when you calculate it on a multiplier effect, which is 2 or 3 times, then the effect will be substantial in the jobs market.
It sounds to me, out of everyone I've spoken to, you're one of the people who is actually taking this Doge committee more seriously than others. So you really think it's going to have an economic impact then? It's not just rhetoric for the sake of rhetoric, but you actually think it's going to lead to fiscal tightening in the U.S.?
This is what it looks like, because if you look at the tweets done by Elon Musk and all of the meetings he's having with the government departments, it looks like it's quite serious. So if he implements it the way he's stating it, then it will have substantial effects, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, interesting perspective. Let's park that there. The other phenomenon, in addition to stock markets that keep trending higher and higher, S&P up 30% for the year, the dollar is an interesting one, because we have seen the dollar resume. People are talking about U.S. exceptionalism. I thought it was really interesting in your notes. You also bring in money supply dynamics going into next year. So just talk us through the rationale of what you see happening and how it's going to impact the USD.
It's actually staggering. If you look over the past 5 years, 80% of the US dollars out there, 80% of US dollars have been created over the past 5 years. That's absolutely enormous. This was a very necessary tool for fiscal policy and monetary policy to keep sustaining the US economy. This is unsustainable. M1 will have to shrink, and as M1 shrinks, there are less dollars in the system. Less dollars means the US dollar will appreciate. So if you look at the gold and US dollar, they're both going up, which is unusual. We have not seen this very frequently. However, if you dig into the 3 components of US dollar, price of dollar, value of dollar, and purchasing power of dollar, the first one is going up, but the other 2 are dropping. The value of dollar is going down against the gold. That's why gold is going up. And 3, the purchasing power is dropping. But the price, we expect it to remain high because of that shrinkage of US dollars.
Yeah, and at the same time, you're squaring it up, though, with a backdrop of the Fed cutting interest rates. And again, you just said that the Fed are going to be cutting interest rates more than what the market is expecting. That doesn't sound to me very dollar bullish.
It's not. It's not. But the balancing power will be between shrinking the M1, so less dollars in the system, while demand for US dollars remain high, we think, and at the same time, reducing interest rates. So that's the balancing act. Net-net, we think this will be stable dollar rather than declining or increasing.
Yeah. Let's go back to stock markets. I'm starting to read analyst notes. It's that time of the year when people are putting out their commentary for 2025. Everyone seems to be bullish on the direction of travel for stock markets. Usually, when all of the market have the same view, something goes wrong. What do you think could go wrong?
Let me go on the other side, which is VIX is less than 15. The demand for downside protection is inexistent. At the same time, the volume for call options is very high. This is generally another very good sign, given that we're heading into a fiscal contraction, and let's admit it, the fiscal expansion has been one of the reasons why stock markets are going up, and M1 expanding has been positive stock markets. So the powers or the ceiling for the stock market seems to be forming for next year.
Yeah, so then you buy downside S&P or S&P puts, given the skew is probably working in your favor.
And VIX, VIX, go long VIX.
And gold, you've been a gold bull for a while, continues next year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Without hesitation. We're heading to $3,000. We hope there will be some profit taking so we can buy more, but we think it's heading to 3,000.
Okay, Ryan, always great to chat to you. Thank you very much. That was Ryan Lemand, co-founder and CEO of Neovision Wealth Management. Well, still ahead, the UN estimates that more than half of Syria's pre-war population have been displaced either to other regions inside Syria or to other countries. Later this hour, we'll discuss the humanitarian crisis in the country with Tanya Evans from the International Rescue Committee. This is Bloomberg.
We've had a lot of speculative issues this year. And we have a little bit more certainty next year. So, half the world's population of the Western world went to the polls this year. We had this tiny election in November.
Tiny.
Tiny. We've got still some major conflicts raging. As we look through to 25, maybe we have some more certainty.
If you don't have a mindset of saying, how should we be thinking? How should an investment team think about AI? I don't know that nobody has the answer, but if you are not thinking about it, you're going to be left behind.
I've seen estimates of potentially $4 trillion in private credit going forward relative to where we are now. So we could see a doubling of the size. And I think one of the elements that would potentially drive that is a way for retail investors to somehow move into private credit, which right now that's really not happening. It's at the very beginning in some cases, but that will also drive that development and make it more, shall we say, the democratization, if you will, of private capital.
We are in the midst of the largest wealth transfer in history right at this very moment. So $100 trillion of wealth is going to next-gen and millennial clients over the next decade. So that has some pretty significant implications. But in addition to that, women are controlling more and more global wealth. Control a third of global wealth, but in the next 5 years, 30 trillion is going to pass in the hands of women, and they're going to control over 50% of the global wealth market out there today.
Some of the world's top female executives speaking in London at Bloomberg's first Women, Money and Power event. Now, for a look at a few other stories we are following. First off, South Africa has suspended operations at its main border crossing with Mozambique, a key coal and chrome export hub, as protests flare in the southeast African nation. Mozambican demonstrators, angered by the result of the country's October elections, have blocked a route that often processes more than 1,000 trucks a day en route to Maputo's port. Investors are piling into short-term Nigerian government debt, lured by high yields and a brightening currency outlook, following the country's successful launch last week of a $2.2 billion Eurobond. The Central Bank of Nigeria sold just under $1 billion of bonds on Monday, with maturities of close to a year at yields of about 24%.
And let's take a look at markets. This is the picture heading into the US and European Open. Not doing a whole lot. S&P futures, Nasdaq leaning towards the green after another pullback yesterday for Wall Street. This was 2 days of back-to-back declines, but overall the picture remains pretty positive. Both of these indices close to all-time record highs. Dow also flat. Euro Stoxx futures slipping somewhat. We're down 0.2%. This after a negative session yesterday with the Euro Stoxx 50 down 0.7%. And of course, investors continue to talk about the divergence between the performance in some of these U.S. equity markets versus European markets. Watch out for ECB decision tomorrow. That's also going to be a big driver for where European equities go from here. Well, coming up, the IMF is to carry out an in-depth assessment of how corruption is sapping Kenya's public finances. We'll have more on that story for you next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Horizons Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Asian investors staying on the sidelines ahead of U.S. inflation data that may influence the Fed's thinking on a possible rate cut next week. Israel steps up its attacks on military sites in Syria, from airfields to weapons production sites, and sends troops deeper into the country. Plus, the IMF is sending a team to Kenya early next year to assess how corruption is sapping the nation's public finances. It has just gone 7:30 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg.
And I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai, where it's just gone 9:30 a.m. Welcome to Horizons Middle East and Africa.
Yeah, that's right, Jumana. And it is US CPI day. We've been waiting for this day ahead of the Fed meeting next week. So let's just take a look at where markets are positioned, waiting for that key inflation print. We mentioned a little earlier, futures, little change as we can see there, both the S&P and the Nasdaq looking like they could potentially start in the green, but still little change. The Nasdaq up just about 0.1%. We're waiting to get that insight into the Fed's potential decision to hold or cut next week. We're seeing swaps trading, though, anticipating about an 85% chance of a quarter-point reduction. We'll wait to see whether that pans out, though. On Tuesday, we did see stocks in the U.S. waver between positive and negative territory before closing in the red, though. We are still seeing them in relatively record-breaking territory. S&P still above that 6,000 print. We're also seeing some notable price action from Brent crude this morning, up just about 0.5%. That is ahead of the U.S. CPI print. Again, trading above $72 a barrel. We're also awaiting a monthly report from OPEC, potentially providing some insight into where the market supply and demand activity is. Gold is also quite notable today. It's down, seeing some downside, actually, down about 0.6%. Though on Tuesday, we did see the metal climb to a 2-week high ahead of that US CPI report. We were speaking to Ryan Lemand earlier, who is one of those gold bulls in the market, saying that his expectation is he believes it will continue to $3,000, though right now it's looking like it's consolidated at just about 2,600 there. Meanwhile, let's check in on the Japanese yen and what the Asian markets are doing. Avril Hong is standing by in our Singapore studio. Hey, Avril.
Hey, Jen. Yeah, we're keeping a close watch on the US CPI in this part of the world as well, and the greenback. So I thought I'd focus on what we're seeing in dollar yen, because remember, next week is not just about the Federal Reserve. The BOJ also meets. And ahead of all this, we're actually seeing quite confusing signals to the markets. And the bets of a December rate hike from the Japanese central bank are receding, most notably after the BOJ announced a pretty unexpected speech that the deputy governor would be giving to local business leaders. This is unusual. So some think that this is going to be the way for the BOJ to communicate to the markets ahead of a January rate hike. So the bets have shifted from a December move to a January move. And amid this, we're seeing weakness in the Japanese currency, although it firmed up a little bit today after a hotter producer inflation print that, of course, feeds the case for the BOJ to normalize policy. So this is what we're seeing in Japan in terms of the rate hiking expectations in the country. Guys.
Thanks so much, Avro Hong in Singapore there. Let's move from Singapore to Kenya. The IMF says a mission will be in Kenya early in 2025 to begin an in-depth assessment of how corruption is sapping the nation's public finances. The East African nation, which has one of the largest IMF programs in the world, requested the assessment in October. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Ndiro Oganga. So, Ndiro, it's another day, another potentially bad news for Kenya. But what prompted Kenya then to seek the help of the IMF to get this situated?
Hi, Jen. So President William Ruto and his administration are facing growing criticism over their inability to curb graft ever since they came into power. Kenya currently ranks 126 out of 180 in the Transparency International Global Corruption Perception Index. And they've been facing a lot of pushback for a government that came into power really popular barely 2 years in. Their popularity has really taken a nosedive. And we're seeing IMF saying that Kenya faces a critical and tough balancing act. They have to raise revenue. They have to honor debt obligations while debt servicing costs are rising. And they also have to set aside money for social and development spending. And what they need to do is have more openness and engagement with the public on policy so they can strengthen that public trust. But the public trust is really thin right now. We saw the government trying to introduce a new tax bill that was supposed to raise 2.7 billion. It was met with deadly protests and the government had to recall it. And also their Dani deal was met with a lot of hesitation. Even before the US charges dropped, Kenya's already saying their Danis are corrupt and this government dealing was corrupt. So that is the current state of the country.
So, Ndiro, is there any expectation this could potentially result in some upside for Kenya?
Jen, for that we wait to see, but what is being perceived is that it will improve investor perception in Kenya, their willingness to be transparent and work on critical issues such as corruption, because it has been a thorn in the country's flesh for a really, really long time. One of the reasons why they find themselves in this situation, again, why they need to curb corruption, is the revenue collection is falling and falling, and so whatever little they have, they need to manage it really well. But also something has to be said about how extravagant this government is perceived to be. Kenyans day in, day out are faulting the government for making large allocations to projects that they don't think are top of mind. The government is setting aside money to go into offices, political offices that are not in the constitution. And this is at the expense of sectors such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, and agriculture. So in as much as the IMF could set aside policies, tools, and instruments that can help Kenya, it's high time that the government maybe bites its gum shield and prosecutes these high-profile corruption cases to the full extent of the law, almost to set an example that public money is not to be touched.
Yeah, we'll wait to see how that pans out. Bloomberg's Ndiro Oganga, thanks as always for your reporting.
And a look at some of the other stories we're following. Doctors in Brazil say President Lula da Silva is awake and conscious after emergency brain surgery. Lula will stay in the intensive care unit for 48 hours as a precaution and should return to the capital early next week. The president's health issues come at a delicate political moment with a fiscal plan hanging in the balance. It's also sparked debate about the 79-year-old's fitness for office. South Korea's President Yoon looks set to fight on rather than step down early as investigations deepen into his martial law declaration. According to a local newspaper report, Yoon has rejected the idea of quitting before the end of his term in February or March next year. Korea's opposition is preparing to file another impeachment motion in parliament following Saturday's failed vote. And Bloomberg has learned that President Biden is set to formally block the $14 billion Japanese takeover of U.S. Steel. We understand the Committee on Foreign Investment panel, which has been reviewing the deal, will refer its decision to the U.S. president by December 23rd. A referral suggests at least one member of the panel sees the deal as posing a risk. Coming up, the fall of the Assad regime offers new hope to the millions of Syrians impacted by the more than a decade-long civil war. We speak to Tanya Evans, Country Director for Syria at the International Rescue Committee, on what has been described as the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. The fall of Bashar al-Assad has offered a glimpse of hope to millions of Syrians forced into poverty following the country's devastating 13-year-long civil war. The UN estimates that more than half of Syria's pre-war population have been displaced either to other regions inside Syria or to other countries, making this one of the world's gravest refugee crises since World War II. The UN also suggested more than 90% of the Syrian population are now below the poverty line. For more, let's go to Amman now and speak to Tanya Evans, Country Director for Syria at the International Rescue Committee. So I can imagine it's been a very busy couple of days for you, Tanya, but you've been on the ground, or at least IRC have been on the ground since 2012, so since the very early days of the civil war. Let me just start off by asking you, how big is the humanitarian assistance need right now in Syria?
The needs in Syria were incredibly high prior to the fall of the former government. More than 16.7 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance. This right now is a watershed moment for Syria. It is a long-awaited opportunity for a new, more stable, more peaceful Syria for all Syrians. But the truth is that the situation on the ground remains incredibly fragile right now. There is continued hostilities, there is continued conflict across the country, and we remain really concerned about the rising needs of people across all parts of Syria, including in northeast Syria right now, where we're seeing continued hostilities impacting the ability of humanitarian organizations to provide critical services.
There are reports of many refugees looking to return back. And over the course of the civil war, I read something like 6.5 million refugees stemmed from the crisis into other countries, neighboring countries, but also as far as Europe as well. Many of those refugees are looking to return home. What can be done, or what should be done to support the return of many of these Syrian nationals who've been waiting to come home for a long time, but are probably going to find the country very different from how they left it?
We need to ensure that returns continue to be voluntary and dignified and supported, and we need to ensure that we're meeting the needs of existing communities on the ground to be able to then support the arrival of new Syrians returning home as well. Their 13 years of protracted crisis has deeply impacted the country. Infrastructure has been significantly and severely damaged across all parts of Syria. There is a lack of essential services as a result of infrastructure damage. There is large numbers of displaced individuals within Syria already who are not able to meet their basic needs. It is absolutely critical now more than ever that humanitarian services are continued to be provided at scale to Syrians across the entire country to meet their basic needs, to support them to be resilient and rebuild, with also then looking towards the arrival of Syrians returning home when they deem it appropriate to do so.
Well, there are reports that some European countries are going to stop processing asylum requests from Syrian nationals moving forwards. First of all, what is your stance on that decision? And do you also think, just as a follow-up to that, that should European countries decide to do that, then in return they should perhaps offer grants or some form of monetary assistance for those who will be returning back to Syria?
I mean, as I said earlier, this is a watershed moment. It is an absolutely critical opportunity for Syrians to build a new peaceful future for themselves, for their country. And so we need to support Syrians in any way possible that we can in whatever decisions they're making. Our job right now, with active conflict ongoing inside Syria, is to ensure that we're able to support people who continue to be displaced, who continue to be unable to meet their needs right now.
In terms of priorities and prioritization, things have to be a sacrifice in the name of securing food, for example. And for years, many Syrian children were not able to attend school. What should be the priority in terms of just the humanitarian assistance? Is it providing food? Is it healthcare? Is it shelter? Is it education? How do you prioritize all of these different things?
there are a whole host of priorities right now, and we need to ensure that we continue, as we have done for the last 12 years, is continue to work with communities to identify their most pressing needs and do the best that we can to support those needs. This includes the provision of essential services such as healthcare. It includes the provision of multi-purpose cash assistance, enabling families to make their own choices about what it is they need to support themselves in this moment right now. As you said earlier, more than 90% of the population are believed to be living below the poverty line. We need to ensure that these people are able to meet their basic needs and not continue to make the difficult decisions they have been making year on year as to whether to send their child to school or meet their health needs or put food on the table. And that's what we need to ensure changes as we move forward.
And how much of what is happening in Syria, what has happened over the last decade, is going to have spillover effects for neighboring countries nearby? We talk about the number of refugees that were displaced to Lebanon. Many of them are looking to return back. But of course, Lebanon itself is plagued by many of the same issues that you've been listing right now vis-a-vis Syria.
Absolutely, and this is it's a pivotal moment, not just for Syria, but in the region more broadly. Our responsibility as the humanitarian community across this region is to ensure that we are supporting Syrians wherever they are, be them at home or be them hosted in another country, and also the host communities who are supporting them right now.
Tanya, thank you for your time this morning. That was Tanya Evans, Country Director for Syria at the International Rescue Committee. Thank you very much. Well, coming up, President-elect Donald Trump has a promise for those investing at least $1 billion in the U.S. $1 billion in the U.S. That and more. Next, this is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. President-elect Donald Trump says his administration would help expedite permits, including environmental approvals for those investing at least $1 billion in the U.S. Bloomberg's John Harney is joining us from Washington, D.C. with more. So, John, the post was get ready to rock. Talk to us about the specifics, if any, that we know about what Trump is proposing and if he can even do this.
Well, what he said was that anyone, a company or individual who was willing to invest $1 billion in a project in the United States would have expedited what is known as permitting reform, otherwise known as red tape, bureaucratic obstacles. It remains to be seen if this can be done. In his first administration, the then president tried this with mixed success, and I will add that his successor, Joe Biden, has often had the same kind of problem.
And so then what does this mean, John, when we talk about potentially what could this get to for Trump's broader energy policy? And talk about this proposal and also some of the picks that we've seen for him, for the people who he wants to lead energy departments. I mean, what is at the heart of Trump's focus for his administration?
He's very eager to advance traditional energy projects, oil, gas. Not so much, in his first administration, there was an emphasis on coal. He sees these environmental and other restrictions as hampering the progress of these endeavors. But as I said, Joe Biden's administration has had similar hindrances with so-called green energy projects, wind, solar, that often have to go through the same bureaucracy. And it's not just at the federal level, it's also at the state level. But there's a limit to how much a president can do. Ultimately, Congress has to really step in. And so far, efforts on Capitol Hill, both in Trump's administration and in Biden's, have come to naught.
Where could we see the most pushback then? Would it be at the state and local level, or would it be at the federal level? You mentioned Congress. He'll have a Republican Congress. So what's your insight into this?
You'll have a Republican Congress, but the House majority will be even narrower than it was in this Congress, and it remains to be seen. It depends what the projects are and what's being proposed, and then, as you said, there are also state entities, and of course some of these, like California, say, would be much more reluctant to approve, say, a fracking project, if not that would happen in California necessarily, but I mean, state bodies are very protective of their prerogatives or turf, if you will.
Right. Well, we'll wait to see how that pans out. Bloomberg's John Harney there in Washington, D.C. for us. John, thanks so much.
Well, speaking of Trump, let's talk about Eric Trump, because he believes in crypto and thinks traditional banking systems are too slow. Bloomberg's Abir Abu Amar spoke to the executive vice president of the Trump Organization on the sidelines of the Bitcoin MENA conference in Abu Dhabi.
I'm at the Bitcoin conference because I believe in cryptocurrencies. I believe that cryptocurrencies are the future. Banking is slow as hell. It's antiquated. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense that banks run on 9-to-5 schedules 5 days a week. When cryptocurrency, you can trade it in the middle of the night on a Saturday at 12 p.m. While having dinner with your wife or sitting on the couch, you can trade cryptocurrency. The banks are lethargic. They don't work for everybody. They leave most people behind. They're expensive. They're lethargic. They're not inclusive at all. And I think the modern banking system is changing very quickly. I think it's one of the reasons you see BlackRock spending billions in cryptocurrencies, and Fidelity and Schwab and just about every bank under the sun. It's the future. I mean, why do I have to go all over Abu Dhabi to try and find an ATM if I want to pull out $100? By the time you pull out the money, you lose 30% on it based on currency exchange rates plus fees for the ATM. When you can literally pop open your wallet, you can send a link. It takes you 2 seconds to do, and you don't have all those problems. You don't have all those structural problems. And so there's no question to me that times 100, right? Blockchain, there's nothing that can be done in banking that can't be done more efficiently using blockchain. And blockchain is changing the world, whether or not people like it or not. And there's a lot of people that see it, the people who are here at this conference. There's a lot of people who don't. The people who don't see it are the people who are going to get left behind. And so I believe in this technology, and my family believes in it. My father wants America to be the crypto capital of the world, and I'm happy to support it today.
The Trump Organization's Eric Trump speaking on the sidelines of the Bitcoin MENA conference in Abu Dhabi yesterday. And of course, the crypto community are cheering on the fact that his father is returning to the White House as of January. They have appointed a crypto czar as well. Bitcoin making new highs on anticipation that we're going to see further deregulation in that space and a crypto-friendly U.S. administration. So that was Eric Trump speaking to Bloomberg. All right, this is how futures are shaping up. We've got that all-important CPI figure coming up later today. The expectation is that we're not going to get massive changes on a month-to-month, but we may see that headline year-on-year print tick up slightly, unlikely to move the needle a lot in terms of what is priced in for the Fed next week. About 85% chance of an interest rate cut is priced in for the Fed. This is a picture of futures not doing a lot. Euro stock futures down about 0.2% as we head into that U.S. data.
Yeah, that's right, Jumana. We'll wait for that. But that is it for us here at Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg alongside Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Stick with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.